The orphanage was nestled in a quiet, unsuspecting corner of the town, its looming, dilapidated building almost blending into the shadows of the surrounding forest. From the outside, it looked like any other institution designed to care for abandoned children. For years, it had been known only for its noble purpose, offering shelter and care to the forgotten souls left without families. But there was something off about it, something that no one wanted to address. The whispers that circulated among the townspeople were always hushed, as if speaking too loudly would invite the unwanted attention of the institution itself. It wasn't until the disappearances began that people started to notice the oddities. And even then, it wasn't an immediate panic or a call for help. The first missing child was met with mild concern, but not enough to trigger an investigation. The authorities wrote it off as a runaway case, a child looking to escape the confines of an oppressive life. Then came the second disappearance, and the third. With each case, the explanations were the same: a troubled child, a history of behavioral issues, a desire to run. The town moved on. Life went on. But behind the walls of the orphanage, a much darker truth was beginning to unfold. The orphanage was not the haven it appeared to be. Inside, there were secrets hidden in plain sight. It was almost as though the building itself absorbed the sadness and despair that filled its halls. There were reports of strange noises at night, shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't, and glimpses of eyes peering out from dark corners where they shouldn't have been. The staff seemed indifferent, too busy with their own lives to truly care for the children under their supervision. In the corners of the orphanage, the children who had once been hopeful and eager began to lose their spark. Some were withdrawn, others acting out, but all of them felt the weight of an oppressive presence that loomed over them, invisible yet palpable. Despite the growing number of disappearances, nothing was ever officially investigated. No one seemed to care enough to look further. The children who vanished were simply added to the growing list of runaways, their faces fading into the blurred backdrop of tragedy. But there were some who weren't content with just accepting the official story. There were some who saw the pattern and began to ask questions that no one else dared to. It wasn't long before a group of survivors, those few who had managed to escape the clutches of the orphanage, began to speak out. Their stories were chilling, their memories haunted by images of a place that seemed more like a prison than a sanctuary. They spoke of the nights when they would hear the children whispering in fear, begging for help that never came. They spoke of the cruel and twisted behavior of the caretakers, who treated the children as little more than objects to be managed and controlled. They spoke of disappearances that were never mentioned, and of a darkness that seemed to swallow anyone who came too close. But even these survivors were only able to offer fragments of the truth. They could not remember everything, their minds clouded by the trauma they had endured. Some claimed to have seen things, strange rituals, dark figures lurking in the hallways, and others who had disappeared but never truly left. Others swore that the orphanage was not merely a place of neglect and abuse, but that it had ties to something much darker, something much more sinister. But the pieces of the puzzle were scattered, and no one seemed willing to put them together. The authorities continued to ignore the signs. In the rare moments when someone did look into the orphanage's affairs, the investigation was short-lived, quickly shutting down with little explanation. It was as though the orphanage existed in a protected bubble, shielded from the prying eyes of outsiders. But the disappearances didn't stop. In fact, they only grew more frequent, more disturbing. It was as if something was feeding on the children, taking them one by one, and no one seemed to care. Years passed, and the orphanage's story began to fade into the background of the town's history. It became little more than a footnote, a tragedy left unexamined. The children who vanished were forgotten by everyone except the families who had lost them, and even their cries for justice grew weaker with time. But there were those who knew the truth, who could never forget what had happened behind those walls. And they weren't going to let the story end quietly. There were still questions that needed to be answered. Why did the authorities turn a blind eye? Why was there such a concerted effort to cover up the truth? Who were the people behind the orphanage, and what were they hiding? Was it truly a case of neglect, or was there something more malevolent at play? The survivors, still haunted by their experiences, were determined to uncover the truth. They began their own investigation, gathering the fragments of information that had been left behind, piecing together the pieces of a puzzle that no one else was willing to solve. They spoke to former staff members, tracked down old records, and dug through the forgotten corners of the town's history. What they discovered was far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. The orphanage was not simply a place where children were neglected and forgotten. It was a place where they were actively being taken, one by one, for reasons that no one could understand. And the people who had been tasked with caring for them were not innocent bystanders, they were complicit in the disappearances. But even worse, there were whispers that the disappearances were not random. There was something much darker at play, something that tied the orphanage to forces far beyond what anyone could comprehend. And so, the investigation began to spiral deeper into the unknown. Every new discovery only raised more questions, and every answer led to more mysteries. The survivors, now determined to get to the bottom of the truth, were left to face the horrifying reality that the answers they sought might be more terrifying than the question itself. But the mystery was not over. The orphanage's past had not yet finished revealing its darkest secrets, and the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The children who had vanished without a trace were still calling out, their voices lost in the wind, waiting for someone to finally listen. It would take more than just survivors to solve this mystery. It would take a relentless pursuit of truth, and even then, the darkness that had consumed the orphanage might never fully be understood. Some things are too terrifying to comprehend. Some truths are too horrifying to uncover. And yet, the search for answers would continue, for as long as the story of the orphanage remained untold, the mystery would never die. The orphanage had a long, troubled history, one that few people truly understood. At first glance, it appeared to be a place of sanctuary, a haven for children without families. But beneath the surface, there were dark currents flowing, long before the disappearances began. There were rumors that no one had dared to investigate, whispers about the place's foundation, its beginnings, and the strange figures who had built it. If the walls of the orphanage could speak, they would have told stories that could freeze the blood. It was founded in the early 1900s by a man named Samuel Hargrove, a well-known philanthropist in the community. He was hailed as a savior, someone who sought to help orphan children by giving them a safe place to stay. Hargrove's vision was simple. He wanted to give these children a future, to save them from the streets and give them the education they needed to succeed in life. But there was more to his motives than what appeared on the surface. No one knew much about his personal life or his past, and those who tried to dig deeper found themselves met with roadblocks. The orphanage was Hargrove's grandest project, one that consumed all of his time and energy. The building was vast, sprawling across several acres of land, with multiple wings designed to house hundreds of children. It had been designed with care and attention to detail, at least on the outside. The walls were tall, meant to keep the children inside safe from the outside world. But as the years passed, the orphanage began to show signs of neglect. The paint on the walls started to peel, the floors began to crack, and the once pristine halls became cluttered and chaotic. The children, who had once been filled with hope, began to lose that light in their eyes. They were forced to live in overcrowded rooms with little privacy and no sense of belonging. The first signs of trouble emerged within the first decade of the orphanage's existence. Children started disappearing, but not in the way one would expect. There were no bodies, no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle. The children simply vanished without a trace. The first case was chalked up to a simple runaway, a child who had grown tired of life at the orphanage and decided to escape. But then another child disappeared, and another. Each time the authorities were called, and each time they came to the same conclusion: the children had run away. The staff, many of whom had been hired by Hargrove himself, were suspiciously quiet about the disappearances. The headmistress, a stern woman named Margaret Cartwright, was always quick to dismiss any concerns, assuring the authorities that the children were simply ungrateful or difficult. She was well liked by the town's elites, who saw her as a strong, no-nonsense leader. But to those who had spent any time at the orphanage, Cartwright's demeanor was unsettling. She was cold, distant, and unfeeling. Her eyes were often seen darting around the room as if she were constantly searching for something, but no one ever questioned her. Hargrove, too, was an enigmatic figure. Though he had founded the orphanage with the best of intentions, his behavior began to change as the years went on. He became reclusive, spending more and more time in his private quarters, rarely making appearances at the orphanage. Rumors began to circulate that Hargrove had been involved in something much darker than charity work. Some said he had ties to powerful individuals in the criminal underworld, while others whispered that he was a member of a secret society with far-reaching influence. No one knew for sure, but the suspicions lingered, casting a shadow over the orphanage that no one could shake. As the years passed, the disappearances grew more frequent, and the town began to take notice. But no one dared to speak out, not even when children began vanishing in broad daylight. The authorities' investigations were always shallow, quickly concluding that the children had run away. In fact, there were never any serious efforts made to uncover the truth. The people of the town, many of whom had known about the orphanage for years, turned a blind eye. Some even blamed the children themselves, saying they had simply gotten lost or had been too rebellious. It was easier to accept this explanation than to confront the possibility that something far more sinister was taking place behind the orphanage's walls. In the decades that followed, the orphanage's decline accelerated. Hargrove died under mysterious circumstances, and Margaret Cartwright took full control. She was ruthless, prioritizing the institution's survival over the well-being of the children. The staff she employed were often indifferent, sometimes downright cruel. Many of them had been hired with little regard for their qualifications, and it wasn't long before rumors of abuse began to spread. Children were reported to have been beaten, starved, and locked in dark rooms for days at a time. Still, no one investigated. The town continued to turn a blind eye, preferring to ignore the growing signs of trouble rather than confront the horror that lay within the orphanage's walls. But even as the orphanage's reputation continued to tarnish, the disappearances didn't stop. In fact, they began to escalate. The children who vanished were no longer just runaways. They were taken. And as the years wore on, the whispers grew louder. It became clear to a few that the orphanage was no longer just a place of neglect. It had become a breeding ground for something far darker. By the time the first investigation into the disappearances took place, it was too late. No one knew who the missing children were, nor did anyone seem to care. The authorities that did show interest were stonewalled by those in charge, who were determined to keep the truth hidden. Even when former residents came forward with their stories, their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming silence of the institution's protectors. But what was the truth behind the orphanage's secrets? Was there a pattern to the disappearances, a reason behind the strange behavior of the staff? Who were the individuals pulling the strings behind the scenes? And why had no one done anything to stop it? In the years to come, the orphanage's story would continue to unravel, piece by piece. But the answers were not as simple as they seemed. The more investigators delved into the history of the place, the more they realized that the orphanage was not just a place where children had disappeared, it was a place where something far more insidious had been allowed to flourish, hidden from the prying eyes of the world. And by the time the full extent of the orphanage's horrors was revealed, it was clear that the tragedy was far from over. The orphanage was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of the town's darkest secrets, a reminder of the children who had vanished and the lives that had been ruined. It had become a haunting specter, forever tied to the lives of those who had once called it home, and to the children whose fates had been sealed in the shadows. But there was one thing that remained constant. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And for those brave enough to look, the orphanage's secrets were not as buried as they appeared. The past had a way of resurfacing, and in the end, the town would have to confront the darkness that had been hidden for so long. But would it be too late? As the years passed, the pattern of disappearances from the orphanage became unmistakable. It started slowly, one child here, another there. But soon, it became clear that this was no coincidence. The frequency of the disappearances escalated, and each one followed a strikingly similar pattern. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no evidence of escape. It was as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. The townspeople began to notice, but the explanations remained the same. The children were difficult, problematic, or simply ran away. But with each new disappearance, these explanations grew more hollow, more absurd. The children who disappeared were all so different. Different ages, different backgrounds, different temperaments. Some were shy, others outgoing. Some had been at the orphanage for years, while others had only recently arrived. There seemed to be no rhyme or reason to the disappearances, no pattern other than the chilling certainty that the children were vanishing into thin air. The town, which had once been a close-knit community, began to fracture. Whispers of something far darker began to circulate. Some wondered if the orphanage itself had become a breeding ground for something evil, something that sought out vulnerable children and consumed them. Others believed that there were forces within the institution, perhaps even among the staff, who were responsible for the disappearances. But no one could say for sure, and anyone who dared to investigate further was met with resistance, intimidation, and, in some cases, outright threats. It was as if the very air around the orphanage was thick with secrets, and the deeper you dug, the more you uncovered things that no one was willing to face. In the midst of this growing unease, there were those who were determined to find out what had really happened to the missing children. Survivors of the orphanage, now adults, began to speak out. They told stories of strange events, of children acting out, of whispers in the dark, of faces seen in the shadows that no one could identify. They spoke of a sense of unease that permeated the orphanage, a feeling that something was terribly wrong but no one could put their finger on it. One of the survivors, a woman named Eleanor, recalled how she had seen a girl named Lily, the most recent disappearance, just days before she vanished. Lily had been a bright, outgoing child, always the first to volunteer in class, always eager to help. But there had been a change in her recently, Eleanor noted. She had become withdrawn, distant, as if something was gnawing at her. Eleanor said that she had overheard a conversation between Lily and one of the caretakers, a woman named Clara, the day before she disappeared. Lily had been asking Clara about the children who had gone away, asking if they were coming back. Clara had looked nervous and evasive, brushing her off with a forced smile. She looked scared, Eleanor said, her voice trembling as she recalled the memory. Like she knew something she wasn't supposed to. I don't know what it was, but I could feel it in my bones. Eleanor wasn't the only one with unsettling memories. Another survivor, a man named Thomas, described a time when he had heard strange noises coming from the basement of the orphanage. It was late at night and most of the children were asleep, but Thomas had woken up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hall. He had gotten up to investigate, thinking it was one of the caretakers, but when he reached the bottom of the stairs he froze. The basement door was slightly ajar, and from within he could hear voices, low, unintelligible murmurs. He had never been able to get close enough to understand what they were saying, but he always felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever he thought about it. The voices were never normal, never human in the way they should have been. There was something strange, something unnatural about them, and that was enough to keep Thomas awake for nights on end. I never told anyone, Thomas confessed, his eyes haunted by the memory. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I swear to you, there was something in that basement. Something that didn't belong there. The more survivors spoke, the clearer the picture became. Something dark had taken root at the orphanage, something that seemed to thrive in the shadows. And it wasn't just the disappearances. The strange occurrences, the noises, the whispers, the unexplained sights, painted a picture of an institution that was not just negligent but actively hiding something. The staff's cold indifference was no longer just negligence. It was complicit. There was something else going on behind closed doors, something that no one wanted to acknowledge. But what was it? As the survivors pieced together their memories, one fact became clear. The disappearances weren't random. There was something deliberate about them. The children who vanished hadn't simply run away or gotten lost. They had been taken. But by whom and for what purpose? One theory that started to gain traction was that the disappearances were connected to something much larger than the orphanage itself. The staff, particularly the higher-ups like the headmistress Margaret Cartwright, were being linked to wealthy benefactors with shady business dealings. There were whispers of corrupt organizations, of criminal activity that ran beneath the surface of the orphanage's charitable facade. These organizations were said to be interested in orphan children, using them for purposes no one dared to speak of. Some believed that the children were being sold to the highest bidder, used for unspeakable purposes by those with power and money. Others suspected something even darker, the possibility that the orphanage was being used as a front for a secret, underground society, one that conducted rituals and ceremonies, sacrificing children as part of some twisted, ancient practice. It was a theory that made most people uncomfortable, but for some, it began to make a kind of sense. The disappearances were not the result of random neglect. They were part of something far more organized and insidious. The authorities, meanwhile, continued to turn a blind eye. Every time a new child disappeared, the investigation was short-lived. The disappearances were chalked up to runaways, a convenient explanation that allowed everyone to move on with their lives. But there were those who refused to accept this explanation. Journalists, local activists, and concerned citizens began to demand answers. Slowly, they started to uncover a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the orphanage itself. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous their pursuit of the truth became. Some were threatened into silence. Others simply disappeared. It was clear that there were powerful people with something to hide. The orphanage was no longer just a place of neglect and abuse. It had become the center of a conspiracy, one that reached into the very heart of the town's elite. And as the disappearances continued, the question remained, why? What had happened to the children who had vanished without a trace? Were they victims of a corrupt system, or was there something darker at play? The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of deceit and fear, but uncovering it would require someone brave enough to face the darkness and expose what had been hidden for so long. With every new revelation, the stakes grew higher. The search for the missing children had only just begun, but it was clear that the truth would not come easily. It was buried deep within the walls of the orphanage, waiting to be uncovered by those who dared to face it. But as more people began to ask questions, the truth became more elusive, slipping further into the shadows beyond reach. The mystery of the orphanage was far from over, and with each unanswered question the darkness grew deeper. Despite the growing number of disappearances and the mounting suspicion among the townspeople, the authorities remained disturbingly indifferent. There were murmurs that some of the higher-ups in the town knew more than they let on, that they were somehow complicit in what was happening behind the orphanage's closed doors. But no one dared to speak out, and no one took the investigation seriously. The disappearances were dismissed as runaways, misunderstood children who had simply wandered off. Yet, with each child that vanished, the town's collective unease grew. The town's law enforcement was nothing more than a puppet in the hands of the wealthy and influential. Many had their own ties to the orphanage, either through financial donations or through long-standing connections to the town's elite. The sheriff, a man named William Harris, had been known to turn a blind eye when it came to certain matters, especially those involving the orphanage. His wife, a member of the local Women's Charity League, was closely connected to the orphanage's board of directors. It wasn't hard for the townspeople to draw the connection between the lack of action and the powerful influence that the orphanage's patrons held over the town's officials. Whenever a child disappeared, Harris and his deputies would conduct a brief, half-hearted search. They'd ask a few questions, visit the orphanage, and then leave, always offering the same explanation: the child had run away. It was always the same story. Always runaways. And if anyone pressed harder or asked too many questions, the inquiries were quickly dismissed, swept under the rug. Those who pushed back were often met with veiled threats, their questions silenced by the weight of the town's powerful elites. But some couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Whispers of corruption began to spread, as people began to notice the strange connections between the orphanage and influential figures in the community. The town's mayor, a man named Gregory Mathis, had been seen at the orphanage on numerous occasions, always just before another child disappeared. The timing was too precise to ignore, and soon a theory began to take shape. Perhaps the disappearances were not random. Perhaps they were deliberate. As more survivors came forward, their accounts painted a disturbing picture. They spoke of the indifference of the staff, especially the headmistress, Margaret Cartwright, who was often described as cold, authoritarian, and unwilling to help when children went missing. The staff, as the survivors described, appeared to be a collection of people who had little to no empathy for the children in their care. Some of them were even described as cruel, using physical punishment or humiliation as a form of control. But no one ever questioned their authority, no one ever dared to challenge them. And whenever children went missing, it was always a case of, they ran away. No one asked why the children would suddenly decide to run away when, in most cases, they had only just arrived at the orphanage. Former staff members who had long since left the institution began to speak up as well. They were hesitant at first, unsure of whether they could trust those asking questions, but soon the details began to spill out. They spoke of the strange rituals that took place after hours, of the secrecy that surrounded the orphanage's operations, and of the high-profile visitors who came and went under the cover of darkness. There were hints of something much larger than a simple case of neglect or mismanagement. There were whispers of organized crime, of shady dealings, and of a system built to conceal something dark. As the investigation grew more complex, it became evident that the authorities were doing everything they could to keep it quiet. The few investigators who dared to dig deeper found themselves stonewalled by the very people they hoped would help them uncover the truth. Records were missing, leads went cold, and key witnesses suddenly became unavailable. It was as if the whole system had been designed to protect something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The turning point came when a local journalist, Daniel Thompson, decided to take matters into his own hands. A young reporter known for his tenacity, Thompson had been following the orphanage's story for years. His investigations had turned up little more than dead ends and vague leads, but he couldn't let it go. Something told him that there was more to the story than the authorities were willing to admit, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Thompson began digging into the financial records of the orphanage, something no one had dared to do before. What he uncovered sent shockwaves through the town. The orphanage, it turned out, had been receiving large sums of money from anonymous donors, but the records were vague. The money seemed to flow in and out without explanation, and there were numerous shell companies tied to the orphanage's accounts. Companies that, when traced, led to well-known figures in the town's elite. It was clear that the orphanage was not just a charitable institution. It was a business, one with far-reaching connections and interests that no one had fully understood. But it wasn't just the money that was troubling. Thompson soon learned that some of these donations were being funneled into the pockets of powerful individuals, including the mayor and the sheriff. The idea that the orphanage was a front for money laundering was no longer just a theory, it was becoming a reality. As the evidence piled up, Thompson began to put the pieces together. The children who had gone missing were not just forgotten, they were part of something far larger and more sinister. And the town's leaders were actively involved in concealing the truth. Despite the growing evidence, Thompson found himself up against an unyielding wall of silence and fear. His phone calls went unanswered, his emails ignored. When he tried to publish his findings, the stories were quickly retracted or buried by the local media, most of which had ties to the very same people who were trying to protect the orphanage's secrets. The mayor, the sheriff, and the local businessmen all seemed to be in on it, their collective efforts ensuring that the orphanage's darkest secrets remained hidden from the public eye. But Thompson wasn't ready to give up. He had already risked too much to turn back now. He continued to dig, despite the mounting threats and intimidation. In the end, it wasn't just his journalistic career at risk, it was his life. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. Strange cars began to follow him home, his personal life was invaded, and anonymous threats appeared in his inbox. But none of that stopped him. He knew he was on the verge of something monumental, something that could change everything for the children who had disappeared and for the families who had been left behind. The investigation into the orphanage had now become a battle between a single journalist and a powerful network of corruption that extended far beyond the town. But for Thompson, there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and he was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. As the investigation into the orphanage's dark secrets continued to gather momentum, one name consistently surfaced among the whispers: Clara Bennett. Clara was one of the caretakers at the orphanage, a woman who had been with the institution for nearly 20 years. Her quiet, reserved demeanor had always made her an enigma to the children and staff alike. To the children, she was just another caretaker, firm but fair. To those who had been around long enough to see beyond the surface, Clara was something else entirely. There was an air of mystery that surrounded her. She was known to be incredibly efficient, a stickler for rules, and almost too perfect in her work ethic. But there were rumors that she had a more intimate connection to the disappearances than anyone had initially realized. While most of the staff merely turned a blind eye to the troubling incidents, Clara seemed to know far too much about the missing children, more than anyone should. It was as if she was always one step ahead, anticipating the next disappearance, and sometimes she seemed almost relieved when a child went missing. Survivors who had been under her care spoke of strange encounters with Clara, subtle but chilling moments that lingered long after. Eleanor, one of the first to speak out publicly about her experience at the orphanage, recounted a memory that still haunted her. "I remember how she looked at me sometimes," Eleanor said, her voice low, almost as though she were afraid to speak the words aloud. It wasn't just that she was cold, but there was something else in her eyes. Like she knew something that we didn't. Like she was waiting for something to happen. Eleanor wasn't the only one who had noticed Clara's strange behavior. Thomas, another survivor, recalled an incident when he was a child. "There was one night, just after the fourth child had gone missing, when I saw Clara in the hall. She was standing at the end of the corridor looking at the door to the basement. Her hands were clasped together and her eyes were fixed, almost like she was waiting for someone to come out. I never understood what it was, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be there." Clara's behavior at first seemed just eccentric. But as time went on, more and more survivors began to share similar stories. There was a certain ritualistic quality to her actions. She would often spend long hours alone in the basement, a place that had been off-limits to the children. She would sometimes take long, solitary walks around the grounds, staring off into the distance with an unreadable expression. And then the disappearances would follow. There was a pattern, a chilling, deliberate pattern that became impossible to ignore. But Clara wasn't the only one involved in the orphanage's dark dealings. As the investigation continued to unravel, it became clear that the staff members were more than just passive participants in the tragedy. They were part of a larger network of individuals who were somehow benefiting from the disappearances. Many of them had been placed in positions of power within the orphanage, and many had ties to the wealthy benefactors who secretly funded the institution. Some of these benefactors were linked to underground organizations, criminal networks that dealt in trafficking and exploitation. The orphanage, it seemed, was the perfect front for their activities. A breakthrough came when an old, tattered journal was found hidden in the orphanage's attic. It belonged to none other than Samuel Hargrove, the founder of the orphanage. It was a chilling read, one that would send shockwaves through the investigation. The journal detailed Hargrove's personal reflections on the orphanage's early days, but it also spoke of something much darker. There were references to rituals, offerings, and sacrifices, which at first seemed like the ramblings of a delusional man. But as more of the journal's entries were uncovered, it became clear that Hargrove's words were more than just the incoherent musings of a troubled mind. He was describing an elaborate system, one that had been in place since the orphanage's inception. Hargrove's journal entries hinted at a secret society that had been operating behind the scenes, one that involved powerful individuals who were using the orphanage as a means to funnel children into their dark network. There were references to secret meetings, coded language, and even specific children who had been marked for special purposes. The more the journal was analyzed, the more it became apparent that the disappearances were part of a larger, twisted plan, a plan that had been set into motion long before the first child went missing. The journal also revealed Hargrove's connection to the town's elites, many of whom had been patrons of the orphanage from its early days. The mayor, the sheriff, and a number of business tycoons were all mentioned in Hargrove's writings. Some of them were listed as benefactors who had provided financial support to the orphanage, but their contributions seemed to go far beyond mere charity. The journal spoke of a shared vision, a vision that involved the exchange of children as part of a larger, insidious scheme. Anne Clara Bennett, the woman who had always seemed to be at the heart of the disappearances, was mentioned frequently. In the journal, she was referred to as a trusted liaison, someone who had been chosen by Hargrove himself to oversee the operation. She wasn't just a caretaker, she was a key player in this dark, underground network. The more evidence that was uncovered, the more the picture of the orphanage's sinister purpose became clear. The disappearances weren't the result of careless neglect or unfortunate circumstances. They were part of a premeditated plan. Clara, along with a select group of staff members, had been facilitating the disappearances, selecting children who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be missed. The children who vanished were taken for reasons that were still unclear, but the journal made one thing abundantly clear. The orphanage was more than just a place for unwanted children. It was a front for something much darker, something that no one had dared to imagine. The investigation into Clara Bennett's role in the disappearances continued, but the deeper the authorities dug, the more they realized that the corruption ran deeper than they had thought. Clara was not just a caretaker, she was a cog in a larger machine, one that involved powerful people with vast resources and the ability to manipulate and control the investigation. Every lead that seemed promising was quickly shut down, every question quickly dismissed. It was as if there was an invisible hand at work, one that was determined to keep the truth buried at any cost. As the investigation expanded, more people began to come forward, offering information that painted a picture of an institution gone terribly wrong. Former staff members, some of whom had worked alongside Clara, began to speak out. Their testimonies painted a portrait of a woman who had been more than just a caretaker. She had been the enforcer. The one who kept the children in line, who made sure that no one questioned the strange events that took place behind the orphanage's walls. But even with the mounting evidence, the truth remained elusive. Clara, ever the enigma, was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared without a trace, vanishing into the shadows just as so many of the children had done before her. Some believed she had fled the town, knowing that the walls were closing in around her. Others suspected she had been silenced, taken by those who had been protecting her all along. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. Clara Bennett's involvement in the orphanage's twisted operations was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. And as the investigation continued to unfold, it became clear that the real story had only just begun. The disappearances were just the tip of the iceberg. The secrets that lay beneath the surface were darker, more disturbing, and more far-reaching than anyone had dared to imagine. The investigation was reaching a breaking point. With each new discovery, the walls surrounding the orphanage's secrets began to crumble, but the truth was proving to be even more elusive than anyone could have expected. Clara Bennett, the woman at the center of the disappearances, had vanished without a trace. It was as though she had slipped into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest of clues. The few survivors who had lived to tell their stories were becoming increasingly fractured, their memories haunted by the unspeakable things they had seen and experienced. But despite the growing number of leads and the mounting evidence, it was becoming clear that something even darker was at play. The orphanage was no longer just a place where children went missing. It was a nexus of a much larger conspiracy, one that spanned far beyond the town's borders. The power that had kept the truth hidden for so long was more formidable than anyone had dared to imagine. Journalist Daniel Thompson had been at the forefront of the investigation, risking everything to uncover the truth. His persistence had led him to uncover vital financial records, revealing the connections between the orphanage and the town's most influential families. But even as the pieces of the puzzle came together, Thompson felt the overwhelming weight of the forces conspiring against him. He was being watched. His every move was being tracked. And the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the situation became. It wasn't long before Thompson realized that he wasn't just up against corrupt officials or a network of powerful donors. He was facing something far more insidious. It became apparent that the disappearances were part of a much larger, more organized effort to conceal the truth about what was really happening at the orphanage. The children who vanished weren't simply being neglected or abused, they were being used in a twisted, dark scheme, one that seemed to have ties to a network of underground organizations, including those with global reach. The more Thompson investigated, the more he uncovered links to shadowy figures from the world of international crime, figures who were rumored to have been using the orphanage as a cover for trafficking and other illicit activities. The children who had gone missing weren't just being sold, they were part of something much darker, something that seemed to involve ritualistic practices, something that had been going on for decades. But despite the growing evidence, the authorities remained silent. They had been complicit for so long that they had no choice but to continue the cover-up. Those who had tried to expose the truth had been silenced. Some had disappeared entirely, while others had been forced into submission. The deeper Thompson dug, the more dangerous it became. Yet he couldn't let it go. He knew that the children who had vanished had no one left to speak for them, and if he didn't keep pushing, the truth would remain buried forever. The breakthrough came when Thompson stumbled upon a chilling document, one that had been carefully hidden from the public. It was an old ledger, a record of names and dates, and it contained the names of every child who had ever passed through the orphanage. But it wasn't just a list of names, it was a list of the children who had disappeared. The dates were meticulously recorded, and next to each name, there were cryptic notations. Some simply said gone, others read taken, and a few were followed by symbols that Thompson couldn't decipher. It didn't take long for him to realize the true significance of the ledger. This wasn't just a record of the orphanage's children, it was a map of the children who had been selected for something much darker. As Thompson combed through the document, he began to see a disturbing pattern. The children who had gone missing were not random. They were chosen, and there was a purpose behind their disappearance. As he dug deeper into the records, Thompson discovered that the children who had been selected for this dark fate were often the ones who showed the most promise, the ones who exhibited signs of intelligence or potential. It was as if they were being harvested, taken for reasons no one could yet understand. The ledger also revealed something even more disturbing. Some of the children who had been taken had never actually left the orphanage. Instead, they had been hidden, kept in secret rooms and passages beneath the institution, and only the most trusted members of the staff knew of their existence. Thompson's stomach turned as he pieced together what had been happening in those hidden rooms. It seemed that the orphanage wasn't just a place where children were taken to be trafficked or sold, it was a place where something far more horrific was happening. The children who had been kept in secret were used in rituals that had been conducted by those in power, people with influence, wealth, and connections. The rituals, it seemed, were linked to some ancient, twisted belief system, one that sought to gain power through the sacrifice of innocent children. The more Thompson uncovered, the more he realized that the orphanage's role in this dark network was far more significant than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a small, isolated institution. It was a key player in an underground system that had been operating for generations. And the people involved weren't just low-level criminals, they were some of the most powerful individuals in society, including members of the town's elite, influential businessmen, politicians, and even law enforcement officers. But the more Thompson exposed, the more dangerous the situation became. He was no longer just a journalist on a mission to uncover the truth, he had become a target. Threats began arriving at his door, anonymous letters warning him to stop investigating. But Thompson was determined. He knew that the truth was out there, buried beneath layers of deceit and corruption, and he couldn't let it go. The children who had vanished deserved justice, and he was the only one who could give it to them. In the face of mounting pressure, Thompson reached out to those who had survived the orphanage, asking them to share their stories. The survivors, some of whom had never spoken about their experiences, began to come forward, their accounts adding weight to Thompson's investigation. They spoke of the horrors they had witnessed, the children who had disappeared, the strange ceremonies they had seen in the dead of night, the eerie silence that filled the halls when something terrible was about to happen. One of the survivors, a woman named Rachel, described how she had once caught a glimpse of a secret meeting taking place in the basement of the orphanage. She had been only a child at the time, but she remembered it vividly. There were people down there, Rachel recalled. I couldn't see their faces, but they were standing around a circle, chanting something. It was like they were in a trance. And then I saw them, the children. They were lying in the center of the circle, as if they were part of the ritual. Rachel's testimony, along with the other survivors, painted a chilling picture of an institution that had been hiding an unimaginable secret. The orphanage wasn't just a place of neglect, it was a place of sacrifice, a place where innocent children had been used to fuel a twisted, ancient belief system. And no one had been willing to stop it. As Thompson continued his investigation, he found himself getting closer and closer to the truth. But each step forward only seemed to bring him closer to danger. The authorities had grown more aggressive in their attempts to silence him, and it was becoming clear that there were forces at work that were more powerful than he had anticipated. The deeper he went, the more he realized that the truth was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And yet, even as the threat of violence loomed over him, Thompson pressed on. The children, whose lives had been torn apart by the orphanage's horrors, deserved to be remembered. Their stories needed to be told, their suffering acknowledged. For as long as the truth remained hidden, the darkness would continue to thrive. In the end, the investigation into the orphanage's sinister operations was far from over. But the more that came to light, the clearer it became. The orphanage was not just an institution. It was a symbol of something far more insidious, a reflection of the hidden evils that lurked beneath the surface of a seemingly innocent town. And until the truth was exposed, the mystery of the missing children would never be solved. As the investigation progressed, the enormity of the web of lies surrounding the orphanage became undeniable. Every corner of the institution, every layer of its history, was steeped in darkness, and it was clear that the missing children were just the beginning of a far more disturbing narrative. The deeper Daniel Thompson delved into the lives of those connected to the orphanage, the more he realized that the conspiracy stretched far beyond the walls of the institution. It was as though the town itself was built on a foundation of silence and denial, a place where the most heinous of crimes had been allowed to flourish, hidden in plain sight for generations. Thompson's findings were groundbreaking, but they also made him an increasingly dangerous target. The more he uncovered, the more resistance he faced from those who sought to protect the truth from coming to light. His research led him to several other towns across the region, all of which seemed to have been touched by the same malevolent force. There were reports of similar orphanages, similar disappearances, and, disturbingly, similar rituals. The connections between these institutions weren't just coincidental. They were deliberate, part of a larger, interconnected system that used vulnerable children for purposes no one dared to speak of. Each orphanage seemed to be a piece of a puzzle, and the puzzle itself pointed to something far greater and more sinister than Thompson had ever imagined. The connections between the orphanage and the town's elites had grown clearer, but the discovery of an ancient ledger, one that had been hidden deep within the institution's archives, provided the final key to unlocking the twisted history of the orphanage and its founders. The ledger was filled with names, dates, and cryptic symbols. It was as if someone had meticulously documented the lives of every child who had passed through the orphanage, tracking their every move, their every moment. The ledger included not only the names of children who had disappeared but also of those who had graduated from the orphanage, those who had somehow left but never returned to their families. The ledger wasn't just a record of names, it was a map of the orphanage's hidden agenda. The children listed in its pages were not chosen at random. There was a pattern, a disturbing pattern, that began to emerge. Certain children, particularly those with unique traits or abilities, were marked for something much darker. These children, it seemed, were not simply being abandoned, they were being prepared for something. Some were labeled candidates, while others were designated as special, marked with symbols next to their names that matched the ones Thompson had seen in the journal of Samuel Hargrove. These symbols, he realized, were connected to ancient rituals, some of which had been practiced for centuries. As the symbols began to make sense, Thompson found himself plunged into a world of occult practices and secret societies. The rituals described in Hargrove's journal, combined with the cryptic ledger entries, pointed to a deeply ingrained belief system that had been passed down through generations. The people behind the orphanage were not just interested in exploiting the children for profit, they were using them as vessels for something far more disturbing. The rituals weren't just about wealth or power, they were about transcending the boundaries of human existence, about using the innocence of children to fuel a darker, more ancient form of magic. The more Thompson uncovered, the more the puzzle pieces fell into place. The orphanage had been founded by Samuel Hargrove not merely out of charity or goodwill but as part of a much larger plan. He had been part of a secret society, one that had infiltrated the town's elite circles and used the orphanage as a front to carry out their twisted rituals. Hargrove's connections ran deep. He had close ties to influential business figures, politicians, and law enforcement officers. The powerful people who had supported the orphanage over the years were all part of the same hidden network, one that had ensured the orphanage's operations continued without interruption. The disappearances of the children were no accidents. They were deliberate. And the children who had vanished were not simply victims of neglect. They were the chosen ones, selected for something far darker. The ritualistic sacrifices, as Thompson pieced together, were meant to harness the children's purity, to use their innocence as a means of tapping into a forbidden power. The more children the society sacrificed, the more power they believed they would gain. It was an insidious system, one that had been operating for decades without anyone knowing the full extent of its reach. But even as Thompson uncovered more and more, he was forced to confront the harsh reality. The forces protecting the orphanage's secrets were too powerful to be taken down by any one individual. The higher-ups in the town, those who controlled the wealth and influence, had created an impenetrable shield around the institution. Every lead that Thompson followed seemed to end in a dead end. Every person he tried to interview seemed to disappear. There were whispers that even the law enforcement, once a supposed ally, had been compromised, bought out by the same forces that had allowed the orphanage's horrors to continue unchecked for so long. The threats against Thompson intensified as well. Anonymous calls, cryptic messages, and even a near-fatal car accident made it clear that those in power would stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. But Thompson refused to back down. The children, those whose lives had been stolen, whose names had been erased from history, deserved to be remembered. The more the authorities tried to silence him, the more determined he became. He knew that uncovering the truth, no matter the cost, was the only way to honor the victims of the orphanage. As Thompson pressed on, he began to make connections between the orphanage and several other dark events that had taken place in the region. There were reports of strange disappearances in nearby towns, all involving orphan children or vulnerable youths. In each case, the authorities had chalked up the disappearances to accidents or the children simply running away. But as Thompson dug deeper, he found that these incidents were too similar to be coincidental. They were all connected, and each one seemed to involve the same shadowy network. The orphanage, it seemed, was part of a much larger operation, one that spanned across state lines and involved people of immense power and influence. The truth, as Thompson realized, was even more horrifying than he had ever imagined. The orphanage wasn't just a place where children went missing, it was a part of a larger system of exploitation, one that involved not just trafficking but ritualistic abuse, a system that had been operating for decades, if not centuries. The children who had disappeared had been selected for a purpose far beyond their comprehension, and the people who were behind it were willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets intact. Thompson knew that the end of the road was drawing near. He had uncovered more than anyone had ever expected, but the forces working against him were closing in. He could feel the weight of their gaze, could feel the shadow of the conspiracy looming over him with every step he took. He had come too far to stop now, but he knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. Those in power would not allow the truth to see the light of day without a fight. But what choice did he have? The truth had to be told, no matter the cost. And so, Thompson prepared for the final leg of his journey. Armed with evidence, with testimonies from survivors, and with the knowledge that the orphanage's dark legacy could no longer remain buried, he made his move. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. But he was prepared to risk it all because the children, whose lives had been stolen from them, deserved to be heard. And Thompson was the only one left who could make sure their voices were not lost forever. The tension reached its boiling point when Daniel Thompson realized that the investigation had finally caught the attention of those at the very top. He had been digging into the heart of something much larger than he had ever anticipated, and it was no longer just a matter of uncovering a corrupt orphanage and a few disappearances. No, this had become something far more dangerous, far more intricate than he had initially believed. It was a global conspiracy, woven together by people who had infiltrated every corner of society, using their influence to shield themselves from the consequences of their actions. The orphanage had been the beginning, the first crack in a wall of secrets. But now the story had evolved into something far more sinister. Thompson had uncovered evidence of an underground network that spanned continents, an international web of trafficking, exploitation, and ritualistic abuse. The institution, which had once appeared to be nothing more than a place of neglect and hardship, was in fact a central node in a global operation that used orphanages, shelters, and foster homes as fronts for trafficking children into a network of criminal activities. The deeper Thompson dug, the more he realized how deeply these people had woven themselves into the fabric of society. There were politicians, business leaders, and even influential members of the media who had been complicit in the network, turning a blind eye to the disappearances and helping to cover up the evidence. The orphanage was just one link in a much larger chain, a chain that stretched across borders, using children as pawns in a game that no one seemed willing to stop. Thompson was beginning to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every step he took felt like he was being watched. The pressure was mounting and the threats had grown more direct. There had been phone calls, hushed voices on the other end of the line, warning him to stop his investigation, to leave well enough alone. His emails were being intercepted. His sources were drying up. One of his key witnesses, a former employee of the orphanage, had vanished without a trace just days after agreeing to meet with him. And it wasn't just the small-time players trying to silence him. These were people with power, people who controlled the flow of information and had the resources to make people disappear without a trace. But Thompson couldn't stop. He had come too far. The children, those whose voices had been lost in the dark corners of society, deserved justice. His own safety seemed secondary to that. He couldn't live with himself knowing that he had the truth and had failed to act on it. The stories of the survivors haunted him. Their faces, their broken memories, their eyes filled with fear as they recalled the horrors they had witnessed in the orphanage. Children who had been subjected to unthinkable rituals, children who had been marked as special for reasons they couldn't understand, children who had been used, abused, and discarded. The ledger that Thompson had uncovered months ago had been the key. It had connected so many dots, pulling together pieces of the puzzle that had once seemed scattered. The names in that ledger weren't just innocent children. They were the subjects of a macabre system that had been operating for decades, hidden in plain sight. The orphanage had been a facade, a front for something much darker, something that no one had dared to confront. The children, it seemed, were nothing more than a commodity, chosen for their purity, their innocence, their vulnerability. They were the perfect candidates for those who believed in the power of ritual, of blood, and of sacrifice. Thompson's own fear was beginning to build, but he couldn't let it stop him. Every new discovery, every new lead, only pushed him closer to the heart of the conspiracy. The evidence he had gathered was undeniable. It was clear that the people behind the orphanage had known exactly what they were doing. They had been preying on the weakest members of society for years. And when the children were no longer useful to them, when they had served their purpose, they simply disappeared, erased from the world as if they had never existed. They had been sacrificed, not just in the literal sense, but in the sense that their lives had been stolen for the benefit of those in power. Thompson had seen enough to know that this was bigger than any one person or institution. This was a global system that needed to be brought down, a network of power, corruption, and manipulation that had been entrenched for far too long. The key players were too powerful, too well connected to be taken down by a single journalist. But Thompson had something they didn't. He had the truth. And he was willing to use it no matter the cost. With each new piece of evidence, the conspiracy began to unravel. Thompson's investigation had taken him to a number of international destinations, places where orphanages had been linked to the same patterns of disappearances, where similar rituals had been performed, where the same individuals were connected. There were reports of children being taken from impoverished regions, shipped off to distant places where no one asked questions. No one cared about the children who had been sold or disappeared. It was a system that had existed for centuries, and it was thriving in the modern world, protected by those who held power and influence. Thompson knew that if he was going to expose the full extent of this network, he would need help. He couldn't do it alone. He reached out to allies, fellow journalists, activists, and survivors of the orphanage, those who had been part of the system and had managed to escape its grasp. Together they formed a loose coalition united by one goal: to expose the truth no matter the cost. But as Thompson prepared to go public with his findings, the danger became even more real. The threats had escalated. His home had been broken into, his personal documents searched, his computers tampered with. He could no longer trust anyone in his inner circle. He didn't know who might be compromised, who was being paid off, who was a part of the conspiracy. The closer he got to exposing the full truth, the more dangerous the situation became. The people behind this network were powerful, and they weren't about to let a journalist take them down without a fight.